Hey out there on the Boneyard, I'm John Rennie, your host from Boneyard Cinema, and welcome to this episode of the Boneyard Horror Podcast. Recently, I've been watching a lot of movies that begin with the words or indeed claim to be based on true events. And it made me want to do an episode asking the question, where do filmmakers draw the line when depicting actual events, and indeed, where should they draw the line in fictionalized depictions of actual crimes? In a recent poll, I asked all of you out there in the Boneyard to choose a movie based on true events. For me to cover, and out of this choice, there were two paranormal movies based on reality, they being Sidney J. Fury's controversial movie The Entity from 1982, about a family's claims they were haunted and assaulted by an extremely physically violent poltergeist. Another movie, which I loved on its release, Scott Derrickson's courtroom exorcism drama, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, based on the notorious true story of Anneliese Michael, a German woman who died in 1976 after undergoing multiple exorcisms. The third choice was Ty West's found footage thriller The Sacrament, which was inspired by the tragedy of the Jonestown Massacre, in which a charismatic cult leader ordered his followers to drink poison. And finally, the movie that won the poll, Charles B. Pierce's 1976 mockumentary, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, based on the 1946 Texarkana Moonlight murders, in which a masked serial killer, who the press reported on as the Phantom Killer, terrorized the town of Texarkana during the spring of 1946, brutally assaulting, dehumanizing and killing 5 people and severely wounding others. So, I would like to thank everyone who voted, and let's dive into a discussion of where to draw the line in filmmaking with Charles Pierce's The Town That Dreaded Sundown. The movie begins with a documentary-style voiceover that claims the words, "This is a true story," and I quote, "Only the names have been changed." Now, to begin with, that is an outright lie by the filmmakers. Yes, the movie is based on a true crime, but many things have been added for dramatic effect. And first, I want to talk about the most notorious example of this. What is quite incredible about the movie The Town That Dreaded Sundown is that in its creation as a fictionalized work based on facts, it is actually, in a very negative sense, taken the tragic death of a very young girl and created a graphic, gory, and stylized death scene around the events of her actual death that in reality has replaced, in the minds of almost everyone who has seen the movie, the actual way in which her death occurred. In fact, in Joshua Zeman and Rachel Mills presented 2014 documentary Killer Legends, a documentary I highly recommend, the two claim that after speaking with many local residents of the town Texarkana, the Texas and Arkansas border town where the murders took place, even the residents of the town mostly believe that the fictionalized events in the movie are how the death actually occurred. I think this is an example of how film can sometimes be a little dangerous in that it is affecting the way that people view the real world and real world events. But of course, there is a flip side to that debate, and that's what I want to talk about. How much leverage is there in changing the story with a creative, and how much artistic license do we give filmmakers in recreating actual events for the screen? I think it's a very interesting debate, so let's dive into it and discuss it. To lay out the argument, in the real-life events of the killing, the victim, a 15-year-old girl, was a saxophone player in a local band, and on the night of her brutal death, she had indeed had a gig and was believed to have been carrying her instrument. Later, when the bodies of herself and her other young teenage friend were found, the instrument was never discovered and became a large part of the case. And famous Texas Ranger Captain M.T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez and the law officials involved believed that it had been taken away from the scene of the crime to be sold, and they went about searching pawn shops and local areas for the saxophone. Now, in Charles B. Pierce's fictional movie of the events, the young girl plays the trombone, and in a harrowing scene of violence, the killer attaches a knife to the end of the slide of the trombone and while blowing through it, extends the instrument, stabbing the girl to death with each gruesome extension of the trombone slide, which is a suggestive and very graphic death scene indeed. This scene has gone on to become an iconic death in horror cinema, and with a quick online search, it can easily be found. When I saw the movie, first of all, and in particular, this scene as a young horror film fan, I was looking for lesser-known slashers when I first saw the movie. I thought it was terrifying. Back then, I knew nothing of the real-life case and believed that this was indeed the way that the young girl had been killed. Now, the events of the murders were already very obviously the most tragic that can befall any human being, let alone someone so young. So the question is, why did Charles Pace decide that he needed to sensationalize the death scene in the movie? And indeed, do you agree that he has the right to do so, when the case was already so tragic and upsetting for anyone involved with the real-life events of the murders? Now, right now, all I can do is talk to you all out there in the Boneyard and give my opinion, and that is that this all comes down to a case of personal ethics. Where do you personally draw the line, and how much respect do you have for others' feelings and the real-life victims of the tragedy that befell the quiet border town of Texarkana when lives were destroyed and they were terrorized by a vicious serial killer? So in 1976, filmmaker Charles B. Pace didn't just make a movie on Hollywood sets. He returned to the scene of the actual crimes, and the movie was filmed on location using some of the same streets, the same fields, and at first filming was met by residents of Texarkana with an uneasy silence. The town found itself face to face with memories that it had tried to forget. The film claims to be a true story, and for many who lived there, that line cut a little too close to home. Only 30 years had passed since the real attacks, and for a small town, 30 years is nothing, and definitely not long enough for scars like that to fade. We have to imagine people who had lost friends, who had lived through the curfews and the fear of the real crimes in 1946 were still there. These are people who are running the bars, running the local shops, and still raising families, remembering those nights where every shadow felt like a threat. Pace didn't just choose to shoot much of the film in Texarkana, he also used local landmarks and even hired residents as extras. On the surface, this all seems very authentic, I think, on his part, and it seems like he is doing a service in that he is helping a community to grieve, but also to tell its own story. But keeping in mind the events that we discussed earlier, and that Pace didn't just tell the story, he sensationalized a lot of the violence. I think he is ethically and morally standing on very shaky ground here, and I can see how his approach to many felt like a cash-in on the horrific crimes, as an invasive intrusion into a community still suffering from a tragedy not yet 30 years old. For relatives and the victims, I cannot imagine how awful this must have felt to watch actors reenact the fear and the violence of 1946 on the same roads where it had actually occurred. And I can certainly see a side to this movie's production where there may be a sense that the line between history and entertainment is being blurred a little bit too much here, and that the past, long buried for the many victims, had been disturbed, and perhaps wrongly disturbed, for the sake of a movie. Now that's one side of the debate. On the other side of the debate, there are residents that feel proud that their small town had caught the attention of Hollywood, and they were proud to see familiar faces, their history, albeit tragic, and their home streets on the big screen. After all, though the events were tragic, they're still a part of the town's history. And I think Pace, ever the showman, in the day, I would imagine that he promised to handle the material with respect. But his decision to open the film with the now infamous words, "The incredible story you are about to see is true, only the names have been changed," probably reignited many old fears of the events. And what he was doing is giving the story a documentary weight, making it hard to tell where fact ended and the fiction begins. Now, was he right or wrong to do this? At the time of its release, especially at local screenings, the atmosphere was understandably extremely tense with residents. Some people walked out halfway through, unable to watch the horrors of the past replayed on the big silver screen, and others described the experience as strange, even haunting, like reliving a collective nightmare. And I love the sound of those words, collective nightmare, in a sense that you can exorcise old demons through film, bring things out into the open, talk about them, and discuss them. And I think that's the really important side of this movie. The film becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting not only just these tragic crimes, but the town's unresolved relationship with its own history, and I think the world's unresolved relationship with tragedy. And yet over time, this is really cool, something unexpected and incredible has happened. The same movie that once had stirred unease in the town of Texarkana began to evolve into a strange kind of ritual. Every October, Texarkana screens the Town That Dreaded Sundown in Spring Lake Park, not far away from where the real murders took place. Now, can you imagine families there at a screening, sitting perhaps, with blankets? Can you imagine children at the town being there? I've never been to one of these events, but I would imagine it's quite a unique thing. And I think what this is doing is helping transform that old fear into something communal, not a celebration, but a remembrance of what happened. And I think that's why this film has a great importance. Now, in our time, the film is undeniably, and I think famously, part of Texarkana's identity. What began as a discomfort when it was first shown in the 70s has slowly turned into ownership, and I think a kind of strange exorcism of the past. The town took control of its own legend, acknowledging the darkness in its own past without letting it define them in the present. And perhaps that's why the story still resonates today and why the movie is more popular with true crime fans and fans of the slasher genre, because it reminds us that healing doesn't always mean forgetting. It's a slasher movie with a purpose, and it's been given this purpose by the town itself, and this purpose grows stronger and stronger with each new true crime fan or each new viewer of the horror genre. And the film was marketed as a horror movie at the time of its release. I think that has to be said. Sometimes movies are made that make us face up to things that haunt us, and in doing so, we are finding a way to live with them. And this is the real power of the true crime genre, and why movies like The Town That Dreaded Sundown are being passed down into legends now and folklore. As a movie, the film did something quite amazing. It didn't just retell the events of a tragic series of murders, it reminded people that sometimes reality is scarier than fiction. Now, for comparison, when Alfred Hitchcock made Psycho in 1960, based on real-world murderer Ed Gein, he showed us the gruesome story as purely fiction. And I don't think in any way does Psycho try to exercise or judge the real-life crimes of Ed Gein. And comparing The Town That Dreaded Sundown with a movie as famous as Psycho, that never professed to be based on true events, shows that perhaps culturally, in his choice to tell the story is true, Charles Pierce made a more important movie than Psycho, as it doesn't just entertain us, it directly warns us. And that gives the movie a very distinct and unique place, I think, in film history. As a film student, I studied and wrote about the audience for true crime movies quite a bit. And I discovered that we as an audience are attracted to the true crime genre in many ways, and not just one as spectators. As an example, when we watch true crime, it is not the same as like when we would slowly drive by a roadside crash, winding down the window and taking a look at the carnage. That is part of us that is some kind of instinct that we all share or perhaps a gory curiosity. But with true crime, we are attracted to it because we participate in a true crime film or documentary because we learn from it. True crime provides a societal service as it shows us a side of the world that is perhaps considered sick, tragic, and bloodthirsty. But what we get out of it is that it delivers a warning that teaches us, don't think that you are safe in your car down Lover's Lane. Be careful where you tread at night. Watch out for dark figures that lurk beyond the curtain of nightfall. True crime serves as a societal purpose because we learn from it and how we can better protect ourselves from the darkness that lies inside of the unknown other and the fears that we have always had since we began what lies out there in the darkness beyond the firelight. Ethically, I have a distaste for what Pierce did in sensationalizing the crimes of the Phantom, and I think he did a disservice to the victims in doing so. But as an advocate for artistic license and a believer that every filmmaker has the right to make and create whatever images they like, I stand by Pierce and say that he had every right to make his movie in the way that he did. But no way in a million years would I have ever done that. My movie would have been very different because I have my own moral and ethical boundaries that dictate what and how I create, and we all do. So I don't think we can judge Pierce for what he added to the story, but I do think we can judge him upon what his film did when it was released into the world and how it is accepted and reevaluated by modern audiences like us today. I think it's a very important movie, and what he did was very important. So to wrap up, I can say as a true crime movie, The Town That Dreaded Sundown takes too many liberties with the truth, but I think it is an excellent work of filmmaking. Whether seen as a true crime film or watched as a curiosity by horror movie fans for its importance as a precursor to the slasher genre of horror movies, this movie works. And Pierce, in my opinion, made a great film because it works on so many levels. It is a visually striking film, and I think it is made by a filmmaker who wants to terrify us into being more careful about how we live our lives. As future generations see this movie, with every passing year, it serves to entertain us, but educate us. And the young fans of horror about the true horrors of the real world. And that, even though I believe the movie does stand on morally and ethically grey ground, is why the work is still being talked about today, almost 50 years down the line, because it has the power to both educate and entertain. And that is a true power of film. Thanks for listening to my take on The Town That Dreaded Sundown from indie legend Charles Pierce, who, on a side note, made a small movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek that went on to help inspire the Blair Witch Project, but that is for another episode. If you did like this podcast, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, as it really does help the channel. I want to say a massive thank you to all Boneyard members and Patreon supporters, and if you do wish to contribute to the channel, please consider joining us here to create independent content creation here in the Boneyard. So please take care, everyone, and remember, some movies are more than just entertainment, they've got a purpose. And I think Charles B. Pierce really succeeded in doing that when he made The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Thanks for listening.